This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It has been 1 year since the January 6th Capitol riots. What occurred at the U.S. Capitol was as unthinkable as it is unforgettable.
The U.S. system of law and government is not opposed to right-wing coups. It has consistently supported them no matter who is president of this country.
We need to be clear from the outset that no religious belief can justify or excuse what the insurrectionists did last week.
President Trump has long promoted the politics of grievance, a contention that he and many rank-and-file Americans have been aggrieved by the elites, the media, and the powers that be.
The events in D.C. on January 6 were not simply the result of deranged conspiracy theorists or a deranged leader. They reflected a deeper truth. At the heart of American democracy, with its law-preserving constitutional ideals, is the law-annulling violence used to maintain this system.
Last year, Canopy Forum authors weighed in on what the Capitol riots meant for law, religion, and democracy. Some turned to political theorists, such as Walter Benjamin, to cast a light on the violence sanctioned at the heart of American democracy. Others revealed the groundlessness of the argument that Capitol rioters were simply exercising their religious freedom. Others drew connections between the Trump era, the rise in Christian nationalism, and the narrative of grievance among some conservatives.
As the nation enters a long overdue period of reckoning, the judicial system must do its part to ensure that violence and extremism not be excused when they march under a religious flag.
Altogether, this is January 6th, 1 year later, brought to you by Canopy Forum. I'm Janet Metzger. This is an analysis of the Capitol protests through Senate Chaplain Barry Black's prayer by John E. King. Early in the morning on January 7th, 2021, the Senate Chaplain Barry Black offered a prayer following the certification of Joe Biden as the lawfully elected President of the United States. Chaplain Black's prayer was the conclusion of a long and dark day in the history of the United States of America. Only hours before, on January 6th, a mob of protesters attacked the United States Capitol building at the behest of the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. The sitting president encouraged a group of his supporters gathered to protest his defeat in the November general election to march over to the Capitol and to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. The next hours saw thousands of individuals carrying Trump flags, QAnon paraphernalia, Confederate flags, and guns invade and attempt to occupy the Capitol building. For the first time since 1812, the U.S. Capitol was breached by assailants. To make matters worse, the building was full with nearly every elected congressional member. Chaplain Black's prayer voiced the anger and frustration of a group of public servants who had attempted to fulfill their constitutional duty and certify the election. Black's appeal to God contained many phrases that decried the day's events and requested healing going forward. However, one phrase, a reference to a Bible verse, made his prayer particularly striking. These tragedies have reminded us that words matter and that the power of life and death is in the tongue. Black's reference to Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21 here offers a stark reminder. The words of one man led to an unprecedented assault on democracy and 5 individuals' deaths so far. Since 2015, it has become commonplace to hear phrases such as fake news, misinformation, and my truth. President Trump ushered in an era in U.S. culture and politics where it is common to label information problematic or disagreeable to oneself as untrue. It has been his habit to conduct himself in this way, and January 6th was no exception. President Trump has fed his supporters a steady diet of claims that the November general election results were lies and false, and that he was the rightful winner. Trump has made these claims without offering verifiable evidence, and he has lost multiple court cases that he launched to prove his claims. Nevertheless, on January 6th, he walked out on a stage, stoked up his supporters with more of these baseless claims, and then unleashed them on elected officials merely trying to do their jobs. There are multiple dimensions to the events of January 6th. President Biden has suggested that race played a part in the response of law enforcement to the mob. Other senators have decried the actions of the mob as terrorism and needlessly violent. However, one dimension, perhaps the simplest yet the most overlooked, is that the value of words is under attack. The behavior of politicians, media, and scholars over the past 5 years have brought Chaplain Black to pray for us to remember that simple words have great power. Not only did Chaplain Black pray that we be reminded of the devastating power of our words, but he also stated powerfully, "Lord, you have helped us remember that we need to see in each other a common humanity that reflects your image." The events at the Capitol on January 6th suggest that the gulf of division between the two political parties in the U.S. has deeply affected how we view one another as humans in this country. Chaplain Black's prayer seeks to remind all of us that regardless of political affiliation, there is shared humanity that we must respect if we seek to continue operating as a beacon for democracy. Human decency should serve as the bare minimum of behavior in an educated democratic society. However, the events of January 6th suggest that we are struggling to meet that bar. Chaplain Black's prayer asks us to remember that we share a common humanity. It is easy to identify with the congressmen and congresswomen and their staff under siege for several hours on January 6th. It is less easy to identify with the mob. Chaplain Black's call on all those who hear his prayer to not dehumanize the people who attack democracy is the bravest aspect of his prayer. This moment makes it clear that Black is both a public servant and a man of faith. It is a core tenet of Christianity that people are called to love their enemies and turn the other cheek. But it is not a core tenet of two-party politics. Chaplain Black appeals to a divided nation to show compassion to those who seek to do us irreparable harm.
This is Anna Knudsen from the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, and you're listening to January 6th, 1 year later, brought to you by Canopy Forum. If you like this episode and would like to learn more about the interactions of law and religion around the world, be sure to subscribe to Interactions wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.
January 6th was a profoundly traumatic day, not just for Americans, but for all those who love democracy and look to America as a beacon of hope regardless of nationality. Nevertheless, Chaplain Black calls on us to respect the humanity of the mob that attacked the Capitol. there is a profoundly American aspect to the response he suggests. Throughout America's history, there have been multiple instances where democracy and its symbols have been attacked by individuals seeking to overthrow them. Rather than give in, Americans have always risen to the occasion. On January 6th, a group of people sought further to divide the United States political community. Rather than give in, Chaplain Black prayed that God might use us to bring healing and unity to our hurting and divided nation and world. Thank you for what you have blessed our lawmakers to accomplish in spite of threats to liberty. Part of the healing that Chaplain Black petitions for includes dialogue and engagement with the very people who attempted to occupy the Capitol. His prayer makes evident that when people of faith like Chaplain Black engage in politics, the outcomes sometimes seem to defy logic. This type of prayer would not shock many Christians in the United States, and many in the crowd at the Capitol on January 6th have most likely heard variations of it in church services if they attend them. However, this type of radical engagement strikes discordantly in the aftermath of such a traumatic event. Senior Republican and Democrat congressmen and congresswomen have all spoken out and vehemently condemned the mob's actions. However, few on either side have called for healing and unity in the same way that Chaplain Black has. In fairness, it would seem out of place for Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell to reverse months of rhetoric that demonized the other side in favor of calling for forgiveness and reconciliation. But Chaplain Black demonstrates the reality that many people of faith navigate when they engage in political activity. There are a complicated set of allegiances to reconcile. Regardless of allegiances, however, Chaplain Black's point is well taken. Healing and unity is the goal in the aftermath of such a gruesome day. The admonition in his prayer that we need to see each other as sharing a common humanity, and that we must realize that our words have a sincere and terrible power to them, are possible avenues that America must explore in the healing process. Chaplain Black describes the terrifying reality that despite their brutal actions and problematic rhetoric, the protesters at the Capitol are humans just like us. We share things in common with them. However, this shared humanity is why they must be engaged with by Republicans and Democrats alike. The events of January 6th will forever remain a part of President Trump's legacy. In his speech that he delivered to protesters before they attacked the Capitol, President Trump espoused his accomplishments while he had been in office and lamented how they were not enough to ensure his apparent re-election. However, nowhere in his speech does President Trump take responsibility for his role in the division in the United States, nor does he change from the rhetoric and tone that he has become known for the past 4 years. Since this speech, he has been suspended from several social media accounts, suggesting that these sites are beginning to tap into the sentiment of Chaplain Black's prayer. Words have consequences. As the United States moves forward from January 6th, Chaplain Black's prayer serves as a useful guide for the nation. We must respect one another as human beings. We must be careful with the power of our words, and we must unify as Americans to protect our nation because, as Chaplain Black says, eternal vigilance continues to be freedom's price. This has been January 6th, 1 year later, brought to you by Canopy Forum. You can find all Canopy Forum articles about the insurrection by following the link in the episode description. Canopy Forum and the Interactions podcast are distributed by the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and produced by Anna Knudsen. I am your narrator, Janet Metzger. You can follow Canopy Forum on Twitter or Facebook and subscribe to Interactions on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.